One, you want to help them, but two, I hear what people are saying.
Good
about
afternoon,
what
everyone.
they want,
Hello.
what what
Good
they
afternoon.
feel reading this book is what the response.
See, I can't tell Marion to pay attention. I have
Yeah.
all the rest of you I could call to order, but she's in charge. So, I'm Carol Mandel. I'm the Dean of Libraries here at New York University, and I'm always thrilled to welcome you here to NYU and to our libraries, and I should say, based on the discussion we just had, and to our food studies collections. Our foods are incredible, thanks to someone sitting right here in this corner who got us started on this, and her wonderful department. We have a wonderful food studies collection. We have an extraordinary collection here in the Fales library, and but we also take pride in that being an important component of our collecting in the library stacks as well. Our goal is to support the research and writing that brilliant people like this panel are doing, and many of you in the audience are doing, and we're always open to suggestions and ideas, not to mention collections, as ways of doing that. So we're very, very proud of our collaboration with the Department of Nutrition, Food Studies, and Public Health here at NYU. And to make this possible and make this a real goal and program here. And we're also very proud and pleased of our collaboration with Clark and the American Institute for Wine and Food that really helps pull together some of the people that are thinking about and the issues and interests that really bring this together and make this such a vital and exciting field. Clark, I'm going to be introducing Clark, who's going to take over this program, and as he does it so well, I want to thank you for bringing these panels to the libraries. It's great. I think Clark is probably known to many of you. He's I was just reading of the things that you've done as food consultant and what that means. And actually, I have this little job for you in the food lounge downstairs. We definitely need a consultant. So those of you who have complaints about those vending machines, Clark is going to reform us, I know. And what he does in his not-for-profit support and work like this program here is just been terrific. And so, with no further ado, because we want to get to this incredible panel, Clark Wolf.
Thank you all. We have a lot to cover today and wonderful people to do it with. But before we do, I have a couple of announcements, and I want to begin by saying that this is the first of this year's 3, and always when we start on the 3, there becomes 4. Yeah. The next one that is scheduled is June 5th, and it's about water, a global discussion of a critical topic. And believe me, it's quite important. Julia Child's nephew, Alex Prudhomme, is writing a book about it, and he's going to share his research in progress at that time. A woman called Maureen Clancy, who has been for 25 years at the San Diego Union Tribune, just retired, wrote a piece about bottled water that I refer to often as Alice water, tap water. And in San Diego, 80% of the people she talked to didn't know what she was talking about, and she changed the way restaurants utilize water on the table in 2 weeks. It's quite a process. And then we hope to have Rick Moonen, who will be coming out with a book, who is a brilliant seafood chef and who has been selling seafood in the middle of a desert in Nevada. I think you've heard of the city, lost something. But it came to our attention that a brilliant book was finally republished, a book called Beard on Food. It was 4 years of columns by James Beard that are as relevant and as resonant today as they were then. We were part of the group nudging for a republish, and what I want to say to you is that the proceeds, what are they called, Judith? Royalties, that's it, royalty. They're all going, royalties. Will go in part to the gentleman who was an editor with Jim Beard years and years ago, and part to the Chef's Fund at the Beard House for cooking, so that they get more support in ordering, all that stuff that they cook and then present. So that's kind of wonderful. That will be in honor of Mr. Beard's birthday. That will be May 1st. here, and it will include a panel that has Ruth Reichel, you may have heard of her, Laura Shapiro, I know you've heard of her. Who else, Tosca? I forgot. Mitchell Davis, who's the VP of the Beard Foundation and the author of so far 4 books, but June's a couple months away, so we don't know what Mitch is going to do. So it should. Oh, and Jim Dodge, who has written wonderful books, is a pastry chef and cooked and worked with James in San Francisco at the Sanford Court when he lived there half the year in the 80s. It's going to be extraordinary. If you happen to be in California on the 3rd of May, a couple of days later, at Copia, I'm doing another panel with Marion Nessel, with Michael Bauer of the San Francisco Chronicle, with Jim Dodge as well, and with a 92-year-old chipper, Chuck Williams. Quite amazing. In the process of this collection of meetings and panels, we have wanted very much to support the food studies program in the department. And I have a quick update today about a piece of the food studies program that has been worked on and we couldn't feel more proud of because it has to do with the whole system of how food moves and goes through our society. Judith Gilbride is here, the chairman of the department. Hi, Judy. Good to see you here. The last time I saw Judy, I'll have Kay Ray come up in a second, but this is Judy Gilbride. Everybody applaud. It's good for your cardio. Come on, she's wonderful. And I have to say, this is a department chair who walks the walk. The last time I saw her was in Maine in a farmer's market, and there were like 5 people, and it was Judy and us. So we know she's the real deal. All food studies faculty, stand up if you're here. There we go. Oh, wonderful. Thank you. Yes. Right. Okay. Thank you. Now, Krishnendu Ray, who we call affectionately K-Ray, is going to tell us a little bit about the food systems program that it's about to launch. K-Ray.
Okay, quickly, thank you, Clark. It's been about a year now that we have introduced a concentration called food systems. And that came about, and I want to just make a couple of announcements related to that. We realized that we have been doing food studies for about 10 years, and which was Marion Clark invention about a decade ago. And in taking stock, we realized that what we do mostly in terms of food studies is culture and consumption. And what had been missing is, and I think Alice Waters had criticized us when this program was put in place, that we don't talk enough about agriculture and that we don't talk enough about processing. So Alice should be happy. We are bringing those things into the curriculum now. And we have a couple of, I'll give you a couple of examples. We also listen to our students, and that was one of the critique of it. So we have a couple of courses, and one of them links to the topic for the next one. It's called, for instance, we're introducing classes now called Food Markets, Concepts and Cases that Fabio is teaching, and a class called Water Waste and the Urban Environment. And specifically, just to give you a quick sense, our specificity in this would be different from the land-grant universities with their big and very successful ag programs. Our focus is on the food system in terms of the city. Urban food systems and its relationship to it. So that's all I wanted to announce. And this is we are about a year into it, and should get quite robust over the next year. Thank you.
Wonderful. That's wonderful news, Claire. Well, and I have the great pleasure to announce an acquisition that will support that effort. Gus Schumacher was Undersecretary of Agriculture under Bill Clinton, and is a wonderful friend of many of ours and of this kind of work. And he has given me, and I'm pleased to present to Marvin and to Carol, here are some preliminary pictures from the family farm history in Manhattan, 72nd and Broadway, 1855 to 1888, and then in Flushing from 1890s to 1938. My grandfather and his sons then moved to Hyde Park and farmed from 39 to 68. I have some movies from Flushing farming in 22 and also from 1960 when I was caught moving irrigation pipe in New Hyde Park on a summer parsley field. As I get some additional time, I'll try and put together a booklet from the family pictures, articles, and movies from the era, including excerpts from my grandfather's diary. He had a daily farm diary. Today the cow, coughed. From 1890 to 1955, daily on farming and marketing in New York City, Gus Schumacher. So it's my pleasure to, and you can all see them afterwards. So this is a photograph from 1888 of the Schumacher farm selling at the New York City Farmers Market, 1888. So this is part of the archive. Marvin, Carol, here's the beginning of extraordinary collection and wonderful papers that we hope you'll all ask your parents and your grandparents and your great-grandparents to also bring. And now let me introduce Marvin Taylor, the curator of this collection.
Thank you. And thanks to Gus for this amazing collection. As best I understand it, his family fled Germany in 1848 after the revolution and ended up in New York. And that being farmers, they started a farm at 78th or 72nd and Broadway, which is just astonishing to think of farming, and farming lasting into the 30s, still within the city limits of New York City. I wanted to announce, in addition to this acquisition, we made another acquisition recently that's related to food waste, because when the department started to go down this path, I thought, oh my God, how am I going to support this? And an amazing collection was mentioned to me. It's the Dennis Kimball and Pope Fruit Farm documents, records. It's about 4 linear feet. They ran in the city, I have to have my cheat sheet here, from circa 1915 to 1923, they were one of the first companies to be importing grapes from California and some of the very first refrigerated cars. And it's extensive correspondence with the growers in California and then with the markets and the places they were selling it to here in the city. And so that's another of these collections as we continue to focus on New York's history and how things got into this metropolis, which leads me just one anecdote that Gus told me. Did any of you know about the farm trains? Gus told me this story. There were trains that would come in from Long Island, New Jersey, to the shore, and then they were ferries. And these trains, one train would have the carts and horses, and the next car on the train would have the produce, etc. And they'd come up to Hoboken or to the end of Queens, and get on ferries, and then come across, disperse, go to the various markets throughout the city, sell their wares, and collect manure from the horses to take back out the opposite way in the evening to use as fertilizer. I always wondered, what did they do with all the horse shit in New York City? And then finally, after 25 years of wondering, Gus Schumacher told me the answer. So with that, thanks to Gus, thanks to you all for coming. And Clark?
These are the mysteries that will be solved when you do research in our collection.
Thank you, Marvin. All right, and thank you, Carol, for being here. I want to mention that thanks to Paula Jennings and the Development Department, there is now a group called the Friends of Fales Library and the Collection. And so there can actually be a membership, and you get a wonderful, to begin with, a collection of note cards that are from some of the gorgeous, some of them antique, some of them a little bit more modern books that are in the collection, hand-selected by Marion Nessel and produced by the department. But I have to let these people start talking. Today's gathering really stems from a conversation with somebody who in our world is incredibly legendary and completely down to earth at the same time. This is a person who got in the kitchen and did the stuff and isn't afraid of it, and is as rigorous a cook as she is an editor. And so what I want to do is begin by introducing and welcoming the author of the newly published The 10th Muse, My Life in Food. Please welcome Judith Jones. You know, it's interesting. Many people want to honor Judith. She'd rather get to work. And so I'm delighted that she's here today. The book, by the way, is in back. It is for sale afterwards. And yes, that is a cigarette in her hand on the spine. We'll talk about that later. I always catch her on that. Next to Judith is a gentleman who's going to talk to us about some of this process as well. And he is the editor of the Dining In and Out. I get so confused. The Dining Pintimento section, right, of the New York Times. Please welcome Pete Wells. And then one of our beloved professors whose name I've finally learned how to pronounce correctly, so he's going to be on a lot of panels. He's a food historian. He's a sociologist. He writes for Gambero, Rosso, and he is Fabio Parasecoli. Please welcome. Yeah? And I can say 3 Italian cheeses, too. And then to my immediate left is a gentleman who I've enjoyed getting to know. This is the next generation. And Francis Lamb came to my attention because he wrote a piece that was so wonderful about his experience in the kitchen for Gourmet magazine that, unbeknownst to him, it ended up in the best food writing of 2006. I mean, it's one of those things where, across the country, we were actually both in bookstores kind of at the same time, and we went, oh, look at that. And that's how it was told to him. Apparently, these ceremonies are really quite formal. But since that time, Francis writes for the Financial Times about restaurants. He writes for Gourmet magazine. If you happen to see this month's Ode to an Omelette, I mean, we were just kind of goofy about it. Francis also has a day job where he assists as a consultant in the development of not-for-profits in Asian communities around the country. He's just come up from Mississippi. I don't even know how that equation works. Please welcome Francis Lam. Now, I don't know if we have the cards. We will pass out cards. It's going to be a little bit more back and forth today because these are all opinionated folk, and that's good. So what I want to do is I want to begin down there, and I want you to each tell me, to begin with, let's start with, give us a few, 2, 3, 4 characteristics or tasks, qualities, focus that you expect from a good editor, whether it be you as the editor or somebody who's editing you. Shall we start with Judith?
Well, I speak here primarily as an editor because my new life as a writer is very new. But as an editor, what I look for in somebody writing a book about food, and it's usually a cookbook, I look for that voice. And if it isn't immediately apparent, I at least want to feel that I can pull that voice out. Because I think we sort of killed the voice in food in all our cookbooks and wrote formula writing. And recipe writing, sharing and teaching a recipe to somebody is not a formula process. It's not scientific. What you want is somebody who has his or her own way of doing something and inspires you and empowers you in the home kitchen all alone when you're suddenly trying this thing and kind of flying blind. So that's extremely important to me, and I think so often, a named chef will say, sure, I'll do a cookbook, and he hires a writer. The writer never even sees him cook. There's no attempt at substitute ingredients when instead of buying 6 different fresh herbs and truffle oil and goodness knows what. And so that's extremely important to me, that person write his own book, or if not, at least have the collaborator there watching, asking questions, catching a voice. I think those are the essential things. That sense of remembering the home cook and empowering. Cookbooks of all how-to books, they don't have different levels. You don't have a cookbook for a beginner and a chef and a fairly advanced, experienced cook. They're all treated the same. And so you have to find strategies to give that information to what Julia used to call the nervous Nellies. And all the information, and yet not burden a recipe with so much detail that the more professional cook doesn't want to bother. So you have to think of things like sidebars, and it's a very challenging and creative process. And as an editor myself, I work very, very closely with anybody doing a cookbook.
Pete, you have had the experience of being an editor in a magazine where, let's face it, in our experience, the editor is the star of that show. I mean, that you're the one with the picture at the front.
Not me.
Not you, okay. And now you're editing a lot of forceful bylines. Is that a polite way of putting it? A lot of forceful bylines. People with their own reputations and at a powerful institution where it's perhaps a different process. As you're talking about your kind of short list of what an editor needs to be able to do, will you contrast a little bit for us, if there is a contrast, between the newspaper life and the magazine life for once a month? And don't look at me like that, like, what are you talking about? So that's what you do as an editor. You look at your editor and
It
go,
was just one question. You made it into 2.
well, all right, see, he's the editor. Go ahead.
Okay. The process at a magazine is a lot more leisurely, and or can be. I mean, you have a little more time to work on things like structure and drawing out the writer's voice, and a sort of a long, peculiar lead that will draw the reader in just through sheer confusion and mystery, which those are kind of the last things you want in a newspaper piece. Readers, we assume, wants to know what the story's about pretty quickly. So we try not to construct long, elaborate leads that leave you in the dark until about the 2000th word. That can work really beautifully in a magazine story.
Right.
Of course, at a newspaper, we report on the news, so you want to talk about what's happening right now, today, yesterday, tomorrow. Magazines, especially monthly magazines where I worked, you want to be timely, but it's a very, very different kind of timeliness where you're talking about, what's in the culture at this moment, but not necessarily today.
Elaborate on that a little bit, the time frame. I mean, we understand that in the newspaper it could be what's important this week, and the timeliness in a magazine, what's the cultural arc?
Well, you're in a monthly magazine, you're often closing 2, 3, sometimes more weeks before the thing will actually appear. And then if it's a monthly magazine, it's going to stay in the newsstands for a month. And sometimes readers won't get around to it right away either. So if you are breaking news, you're pretty lucky. But by the time the reader's gotten to it, it's probably already entered the ozone and they've picked up on it someplace. But at the same time, you don't want it to feel like something that could have been written 10 years ago. It should feel of the moment, but it can't really be of that precise moment.
Well, we're going to get back to something that you just raised in a little bit, but thank you. Fabio, give us a couple of your characteristics about your experience in good editing.
As an editor, for me, it's very important, especially in Italy, I deal also with, personalities, TV personalities and whatnot. Oh. And as the word says, they have personalities, meaning that whatever they say, that's it. And as an editor, sometimes it's a work of patience and mediation to work with these people and just try to get the best out of them, and also push them to be a little more precise. I was working with this very famous journalist who wrote a very nice book on herbs. And I was doing the editing, and he was going, herbs all over the world. And for him, the tang and the qing in China is the same thing. And it was, and when I was, just pointing out a few elements in history, he got mad. Because, that's irrelevant. That was his answer. So, and sometimes, in my experience, when you work with big TV personalities and whatnot, it takes a lot of patience. And, just go in your Zen zone and talk to them and try to work with them. So it's fun in a way. I work also to teach new writers to come out. In Gambero, Rosso, we have this school for journalism and communication in food and wine. So every year I have a new batch of students that want to do that. So it's very interesting as an editor, to try to teach them, how to construct a piece and exactly the arc and what to do with it. And then with the nicest pieces, we try to do something. This year we put them on our website, so everybody could read them, all over the country. They were very happy with it. When I'm an editee, I like also my editor to be patient with me, especially with my English, because sometimes I write, English is not my first language. So these days I'm working with a fantastic editor in Oxford that, despite his all, Britishness, is very gentle, very nice, and he really works also with me on the content. I'm writing on pop culture, and he's bouncing ideas with me while we work, so that's a fantastic experience.
Great. Francis, how about for you? And I know, again, you deal with more than one editor on a regular basis, and in each context you deal with a few editors. By the way, these are very sensitive mics. And it just occurred to me, these are all people who tend to present themselves to us behind their words or behind the words of other people. So I have to say, it's a real privilege, and we appreciate your coming out from behind the pen to be here. Anyway, Francis.
Okay. Well, first, they say when you speak in front of a crowd and you're a little nervous, what you do is imagine everyone in their underwear. And it's easier to do that when you're at home behind a computer, but maybe I shouldn't talk about that. So an editor...
I think you do want to talk about that.
Standing over here.
Okay, so I've been thinking about this question, right? Largely because I have to come here and talk about it and try to sound like I have something to say. And so when I thought about the idea of, so I went back to think about some of the best work that I feel that I've done with an editor, and what that work has been like, and what that process was like, and what that has always felt to me. And this word has come up twice already. What that's always felt to me, most similar to is teaching, right? In the way that when I think of great teaching, I think of someone who asks questions, asks great questions, rather than someone who gives answers, right? Like that's what I think about when I think of great teaching. And I think of my sort of best work with editors as being a communication and being a back and forth between myself and this person who can look at the piece and ask the questions of the piece that need to be asked, ask the questions of the ideas, ask the questions of the language, really ask, what are you trying to say? How are you saying that right now? And push me and challenge me. Another thing I think of when I think of great teaching, right? A teacher pushes and challenges the student just outside their comfort level. So where it's productive, sort of a productive discomfort, right? And so I find that, like, whenever I file a piece, I sort of dread a little bit the email from the editor. I sort of dread a little bit the call, because it's going to be uncomfortable. They're going to ask the questions. I'm going to be like, oh, I was kind of hoping you didn't notice that. But that's what you need, right? That you need someone to do that pushing. But also another thing, that I think is really important is do that in a way where you really allow the writer, and maybe this is just me and my ego talking, but really allow me to try to find a way to fix the things that need to be fixed, right? To really do it in the voice that I'm trying to present, put the idea that I was trying to maybe not really getting to, but like make me refine that so that it's helpful for me.
Judith, I mean, you've had some of the most extraordinary and legendary experiences with writers and that whole process. I mean, will you tell us a little bit about, I don't know, working with Julia, working with Edna, working with Marion Cunningham?
Well, I can say that each one is different, but in over 50 years of being a general editor, working on a cookbook takes the most time, the most patience, the most involvement, and that's probably me. I mean, I throw myself into it. For instance, I once, early on, I think it was for Mastering the Art, Volume 2, I said to Julia casually, well, I said two things. One, don't you think it would be nice to have a French bread? Because in those days, you couldn't get a decent baguette, even in New York. And I said, a French meal isn't really a French meal without a baguette to mop up the sauce. And she said, you're right. So she was busy finishing a lot of elaborate recipes. So she said, I think Paul, her husband, could do the research. He used to make bread when he was in college. So poor Paul started making French bread, starting knowing nothing. And he actually sent them to me in New York. They were living in Cambridge. And I'd open this parcel post package and find this. It looked like the limb of a gnarled old olive tree. And make a long story short, Julia finally said, we'll take the flour and the yeast and even the salt, and we'll take them to the best bread teacher in France, and we'll find out what's wrong. So she did. But another time I just said casually, this was to make a cassoulet, and you couldn't find just a little French garlicky sausage essential for a cassoulet. And I said, do you think you could just make it and we could use a patty? Sure. And the next time I was up in Cambridge, her kitchen wall was covered in statistics. She had gone back to old charcuterie books of the 18th century, I think, and tried these recipes in her notes, and gradually she got up to her own formula. And I said, Julia, how marvelous. And she said, well, it's easy. It's just as easy as making a hamburger. But she had done the work.
Well,
now, she was somebody you could, that was just who she was and why she was such a great teacher. Other people are more skittish, but
oh,
so
go
you have
ahead.
to
Go,
figure
go.
out ways
You can
to
tell
get-
us one of those stories too, if you like.
I once said to Lydia Bastianich, for instance, had made a beautiful lasagna, and all the dough was used up except for one long stocking shape. And I said, I knew what I was doing. I said, Lydia, you going to throw that out? Good heavens, no, said she. And she picked up the stocking, looked at it. And then she got a little baking dish, and she went like this with the stocking, and she plopped a little meat sauce, she plopped a little cheese, she plopped a few vegetables, and just built this nice little pyramid in this little dish. And she said, my lunch tomorrow.
Perfect.
Well, of course, we put it in the book, because that is what is, to me, missing in so many cookbooks, that we don't treat cooking as a rhythm through the week, how you use something if it's not used up, how you plan for the next day. And she just fell into this. She loved doing it. So,
Well, you talked about, you said a couple of times, a casual comment. Casual comment from Judith Jones, right? Not a casual comment. And to Julia Child. These are serious people with serious comments. Pete, you have a deadline, and at the other end of it is not going to be maybe 3 months or 6 months or 12 months of people communicating to France. It's going to be a story in the New York Times. And you're going to have to stand behind that story. So in the process, will you tell us a little bit about, for example, I was very impressed and very interested by the piece that Marion Burroughs did on the Mercury and tuna, right? Extraordinary. And the firestorm of letters and public editor and emails and blogs and, gnarled oak tuna arms being sent to the mail to people. Tell us a little bit about the process there, where the role of the editor is less to gently suggest to a brilliant mind what they might explore, and more about vetting a killer headline to make sure, and what that process is all about. Being the editor in that process.
It was really simple.
You're lying. Go ahead.
Not much to tell. Oh boy. Well, I mean, Marion Burroughs worked on that story for a long time, 6 months or more, and I'm not sure I even knew what it was about until after we published it.
Wow.
And we're defending it, and I think that's when it started to come together for me, which is probably not ideal. Probably I should have understood the story maybe just before we published it.
that would
But
be
it
good.
doesn't always work that way. Sometimes you don't know what you're doing until you've done it. What was involved in that? All we knew really from the beginning was that we were going to test some tuna for mercury, because Marion thought that people were eating a lot of fresh tuna in the form of sushi, and didn't know what she knew, which was that it was high in mercury. So we knew something that we thought the readers probably didn't know. And from that simple idea, a ton of research and many drafts and just about everybody in all the editors in the dining section worked on it and vetted it extensively. And then when we found out that the paper was interested in putting it on the front page, then a whole new raft of editors got involved, just kind of what Francis was just saying. Every new person who looked at it asked a new question, and you're trying to, I guess, to anticipate the questions that the reader is going to ask, and you hope that that by the time you get it into print, you'll have answered all of the reader's questions. As you hope that the reader doesn't get to the end of it and say, "What was that about?" You know.
Yeah.
So, with a complicated story like that, I'm not a huge believer in editing by committee, but with that kind of story, I think it really helped.
But then you kind of refer to the fact that your job as an editor didn't end with the publication of the story.
No, not in that case, no.
So tell us a little bit about that, because I think it's fascinating for people.
Well,
He's reliving it. It's painful. But well done.
we were challenged extensively on that in particular by a few people, but in particular by a group that represents the fishing industry, and their first comment was, "How come we're not in the story?" And then after that they challenged every comma and semicolon in it, and really kept me busy for a couple of weeks, where I was not doing much else except answering their letters to me, their opening bargain was, "We want you to retract the whole story." And then I just had to keep coming back to them saying, this thing that you say is wrong is right. This thing you say is wrong, we never said. And it just went on from there. But and then it was written about all over the place, and I didn't really deal with that. I mean, a few other newspapers and some online publications who challenged the piece. I didn't get into answering that. But then when the public editor of the New York Times got involved, I did have to deal with that, and that's a peculiar institution within the Times, where there's somebody is supposed to be the representative of the readers, who is both a journalist and how should I put it? Curmudgeon. Yeah,
Curmudgeon, right.
He's has a sort of unique role where he both reports on what happens within the Times and weighs in on what he thinks about it all.
How many of you have ever read the public editor column? I call it the other Clark, right? And so what you're talking about is you had a public conversation, really a very public, on-the-record conversation with a lot of people all at once over this article that you understood moments after it was published.
No, this was part of the learning to understand the article.
There you go. It was all together. Well, which brings me to the issue, and again, I don't want to speak for anyone, but to me, we all know that we trust certain voices with certain stories. I mean, for myself, if Marion Burroughs is at the top of it, I'm going to be pretty sure that it's going to be tooth and nail to the letter. It's going to be right. It's going to be correct. Talk a little bit about, Fabio and Francis, about matching the combination of acquisition and composition. The idea, is it the right writer for that story, or is it the editing of any story to turn that story into something that's appropriate? Talk a little bit about putting the personalities and the talents together. Let's start with Fabio and obviously Francis, and then Judith. Of course, we have to get back to you about that one.
Well, as a normal policy at Gambero Rosso, we try to give the dangerous stories to people on staff, people that have worked on stuff for 10, 15 years, because we end up in those situations quite often. Like recently, last year, there was a piece on prosciutto di Parma, and one of our oldest editors dared to say that not all prosciutto di Parma is good because it's got a stamp on it of prosciutto di Parma, and which is absolutely true. But it created a big havoc in the industry. Of course, all the advertising and disappeared and all that. That's pretty normal. So we know how that happens. So we are very careful to who we give stories, especially if they're big ones. And there's also a different impact depending on where they are. On the website, we go on the daily, day-by-day thing, so we try to break news, but then there's more space for discussion, people can answer back and whatnot. Then we have the TV channel, and there we put stuff on a weekly basis. We have the magazine, which is a monthly, and the stories are closed 3-4 weeks before it goes out. And then we have the books. So for the books, we try to give voice to interesting people. Very often it's celebrities or personalities that get in touch with us, asking if we're interested in publishing things. Other times we ask people to write. But when it comes, to that sort of dangerous news, or another time we had a problem with Ferrarelle. I don't know if you're familiar with the water. I don't know if it's sold here in the States.
It is.
But we had an analysis of the water, and basically the public water in Rome turned out to be better than Ferrarelle. Now that was a big sting too.
Yeah.
And it went to court all the way.
Oh my gosh.
But of course we had the analysis, so they couldn't say much. But that's the kind of story you want a very vetted editor, a very expert editor to manage. Very often it goes to the publisher, and he manages them himself.
Wow.
Yeah.
Francis, again, maybe from a different perspective, do you get assignments or suggestions of assignments that don't feel right for your voice, or do you seek a certain kind of story, or do you just sit with an editor and say, okay, these are the 5 things I'm thinking about and that I would like to noodle about in a story for you?
Sure. It's some combination of those, right? To be frank, as a writer, you're kind of always starving for work, so you want to say yes to everything. But and I've said yes to things that I'm like, I don't really know. Like, I don't really know that I care about this subject. I don't really know that I want to care about this subject, but I kind of can't refuse it. And not that I compromise myself, but I thought, okay, well, sort of convince me, right? Like, let's have a conversation. Again, it comes back to this idea of conversation with your editor. Let's have a conversation. Why are you interested in this? Like, that's the question I want to ask the editor. And does that jibe with something that is a question I want to explore? And in one case, actually, I ended up going to a part of the country that I didn't think I was particularly excited about, and because I had this assignment, the editor had convinced me that there was a reason to be excited about it, and so I went with a sort of skepticism, and I think that actually ended up being sort of the backbone of my story. The idea that I wasn't there because I was already enchanted with it. I wasn't there because I was already psyched about it, but I was there because I was curious about it. And I think, for me personally, the thing that I want to be able to present in a lot of my stories is that sense of discovery and that sense of wonder. I'm really invested in that as a person. Like, that's something I really look for in the world. And so I really want to be able to, experience things where I'm constantly like, oh my God, I didn't know. Holy shit, like, and that's something I want to translate on the page. So in that sense, I think, it's important to have interests that you really know you want to discover, and also have things that you are willing to explore and willing to say, I'm not only going to do things that are shiny toys.
Right. So what part of the country was it?
That's where you live, Clark.
I had a feeling you were going there. Francis wrote a rather wonderful piece about Western Sonoma County in the October issue of Gourmet, and it was stunning and shocking and wonderful because it was so vividly true. For all of us who spend some time out there, part of the lead was that he talked about strawberries that have flavor that candy aspires to. And as he was driving through it, he said something about he wants to write about the air, he wants to write about the land, he wants to write poetry. It's like, okay, fine, hey, it's your assignment. And there were a lot of people who looked at the piece and said, gosh, Red's recovery room, the guy in the back with the tattoo, it was such a pleasing, real experience because that's what the writing was about. And Judith, you have had real experiences with extraordinary writers. Is it your moving, sidling over to their voice, or having their voice kind of moved over or distracted with a casual comment to the bread? I mean, what is that process of matching the voice with the writing?
I don't think it's so much matching as pulling it out of somebody.
Okay.
But I have been interested in odd books. We did just a delightful book by Andrew Todd Hunter called A Meal Observed.
Yeah.
And that just came to me. It wasn't quite finished, but the idea was simply to observe the whole process of a beautiful French meal in Paris at a Taïwan, very high-class restaurant. And as Americans, we're sort of nervous when we go into a place like that. We aren't sure we're going to behave properly or do the right thing. And so he told it from that point of view, going in with his wife and feeling sort of self-conscious. And then all of a sudden, halfway through, well, a third of the way through, you found out that he had been working in the kitchens. But so he had the behind-the-scene view. I feel there should be more books that just are about the food experience. When I decided to do this little book, I distinctly wanted it, My Life in Food, because that, as I thought about it, it was really what shaped me, what released me from my family in a way, who were my mother was very English and conservative, and we never had garlic in the house or onions and all those smelly things. We're always opening the windows and closing the doors so the house wouldn't smell. And it was just a great release to go to Paris and wallow in the sheer pleasure of food. And it's as Bria Savarin says, it's the pleasure that lasts the longest. All the others fade, but you can have it right up into old age. And I just wanted to get that message across, sort of telling my own story as not an example, but just, this is how I did it, and it was fun. You'll have fun too.
You talk about that, and by the way, I'm not going to make any of the obvious current political jokes that could have been made there. I was very good about that. You suggested this whole experience of food, and I want to ask you all, Judith particularly, and Pete, you discovered and brought to publication the Anne Frank diaries. Mm-hmm. You're somebody who sees something that maybe other people have seen as well. And you say, like pornography, you know it when you see it. You say, oh my goodness, that's something. Pete, you do that too. That's your job. That's what they pay you for, to say, that's a story. That's not a story.
The instinct,
but tell us a little bit about that, if it wouldn't totally destroy the alchemy at this point in your career.
Well, in the story of Anne Frank, I was working for the Doubleday editor in Paris, and he'd gone off to have lunch with some French publishers and told me to get rid of these manuscripts. He'd looked at them, and so I was writing the rejection letters. It was a big pile. And I go towards the bottom, and I found this advanced copy of a French book, and it was the Diary of Anne Frank. And I looked at that face on the cover, and it just drew me in. And I sat and read all afternoon, and when my boss finally came home, he said, what are you doing still here? And I said, we've got to call. You didn't make transatlantic telephone calls in those days. I think I said we have to send a telegram and tell Doubleday they've got to publish this book because it's just one of a kind. He said, what? The book by that kid? And I found out later that at least a half a dozen publishers had turned it down. And why? I think because there wasn't a precedent for it. And I think you just have to follow your own instinct about these things. And certainly when I encountered this tome on French cooking, I just thought this book had been written for me, because I had spent that time in France, come back to America, and it seemed like a wasteland. There were no cookbooks that really instructed you, told you what substitute materials you could use, because we didn't have all shallots, leeks, mushrooms. You never saw them in a supermarket. So you really needed somebody to take you by the hand and teach you the techniques and empower you. And that's what this book did. I think it really, in a way, changed forever the way we think about food and the way cookbooks are written, particularly when we got this big Smith college girl on television who called herself the French chef. And it's as though we had been suppressed all these years and our appetites were finally released. And I think we've been having fun with food ever since, although we still have a kind of love-hate relationship, if you know what I mean.
I think, we do. Pete, again, for you, the process of identifying, I mean, as a magazine editor, many ideas come to you and they're proposed to you. Some of them come at editorial meetings. But at a newspaper, with the position yours holds, How does that work? Are there things that you generate in meetings and conversations? Are there things that are brought to you? How do you look at a topic and say, that's us, we got to do that, and you're the writer to do it?
Well, one of the things that you try to do is learn to pay attention to your reactions, even the tiny ones,
Yeah.
and sometimes things that you are ashamed of or want to suppress. Like if often I will find that I can't finish like a pitch that's come to me. Somebody will send me an email. I want to, here's a great story for the New York Times, and after the second sentence, I can't go on.
That's a pretty good indicator.
But I'm very slow to blame the writer because I think, that it's my fault because I'm just distracted. There's a lot going on around me. So I've learned to pay a little bit more attention to like what if I'm on to something else before I've even finished this, maybe it's not going to go anywhere. And conversely, sometimes an idea will seem interesting, but then I'll ask the writer, "Oh, okay, so what else would be in the story?" And there isn't anything else. There's this great restaurant opening. Oh, tell me more. Well, it's a great restaurant. It's going to be great. The chef is really famous, and we should write about it. Well, tell me more. Well, the restaurant is opened by the chef, and he's very famous. So if I can't start to get a picture of what this story might be and how it could possibly be interesting, then I try to say no, even though on some intellectual level you might be able to persuade me, like, the chef is so famous, we need to write about his restaurant. But if you can't convince me to keep my eyes open long enough to hear why you think it's a good story, then maybe it's not a good story. So. That same sort of listening to your reactions is for me is one of the ways that I edit as I'm going through the story line by line, word by word. Often, all the time, I'll be confused by something, and I have to convince myself that I'm not confused because I'm stupid or because I was looking out the window, and I'm confused because it's confusing, and so then I have to go back to the writer. But it hasn't come naturally to me. I've had to sort of teach myself that the reactions that I'm having probably come from something that is not just about my own intoxicated craziness.
Right. Well, all right. Speaking of intoxicated craziness, craziness, and we'll continue on. And Pete, you can comment on this. And by the way, as long as you promise not to fill all of these pieces of paper with pitches for stories for Pete, if you have questions that you'd like to write down on those pieces of paper that Tosca gave you and send them up, we do have a little bit of time, and I'll vet through them, and I'll make sure that the dirty words are crossed out. So send them up if you have them. But in the meantime, how much is, because you talked about a very sensitive response, is the sensitive response to you as the editor or to the reader, or are you responding on behalf of the reader, whether you're the editor or the writer? Pete, you want to?
Well, you hope that you are responding on behalf of the reader. You hope that you're asking the questions the reader will ask, making the objections the reader will make. The reader will say, "Wait a minute, that didn't happen that way. Those things aren't really the same." Again, sometimes you have to force yourself to do it because we have. I like the writers I work with, and I don't want to say, this third paragraph, it doesn't make any sense, but you've got to do it, because if you don't do it, the reader's going to do it.
Well, we'll get back to that, because I want to go back to something that you've just brought up and that Judith mentioned about corrections, and actually you said the same thing, Fabio, making a correct. Well, go ahead and comment on that, and then we'll get to the other.
I wanted to comment something about cookbooks. What Judith was saying was relevant for us too in Italy, because in Italy for 30 years there was a big void of transmission of cooking, meaning that we're supposed, to learn how to cook from our moms. As a matter of fact, our moms don't know how to cook any longer. So if you're lucky, it's your grandmother. If you're lucky, it's your mother. But there is a whole bunch of people in Italy that don't know how to cook any longer. So as a publisher in food, we had to find a way to get people to rediscover their traditions in a very easy, in a very practical way that people could do in their daily life. The problem is that in the 60s, half of the South moved north. They didn't want to be connected with their rural origins any longer, with their traditions and dishes. People in the North would make fun of them at certain points. They wanted to be modern, to work in the industry, who's got time to work in the kitchen, and women started working, the whole story. In Italy started in the 60s.
Wait a second.
Later.
We just didn't know it was happening in Italy. We are so relieved to know that they went through it too, aren't we?
Oh,
I know I am.
Well, this happened around the 60s when finally, after the war, the industrialization took off. So in the South, there was no jobs. In the North, there were lots of jobs, and so there was a mass migration into the North. But anyway, the situation is that there was this chain of transmission, and the chain of transmissions was broken. So when Gambero Rosso started again, we were lucky enough to have this woman working with us that was able to take very traditional, very daily recipes and make them relevant and modern and possible for people who were not able to cook any longer. And when I was thinking, you have to think what your reader thinks. For us is, okay, we have to think that we're writing for people that probably don't know how to do this.
Yeah.
So we have to explain every little piece of the technique. Not everybody knows how to fry. Not everybody knows how to recognize, a fresh apple. I mean, we read that.
Or how to cut up an onion.
Exactly. So you really have to start from the beginning. So eventually we decided to have books and recipes that go for a wide audience, and then more specific books by chefs that can be used by people who already have experience and want to learn something more. But the two books are completely different, and the kind of questions that we imagine in our minds from the readers are completely different.
Well, again, this brings up a topic for all of you, the timelessness of writing. I mean, the fact is, and I want to start with Francis, this book, Beard on Food, was written a long time ago. It was 4 years of columns, and you read it like it was written Thursday. As writers and editors, how much do you think about what is somebody going to, we're in a library, for goodness sakes. We want to have words around that can be useful and helpful to us, not just in studying history, but in thinking now, in learning now. How much does that play into your mind or to your work with regards to the timelessness of what's being put on the paper?
Well, the reason why I can't say anything right now is because I'm thinking. But the reason why I'm thinking so hard about it is because I'm considering the idea that, I'll be frank with you, I'm not writing for posterity.
Okay,
Right.
that's what I was just asking.
When I sit down to write something, I think, here's a story I want to tell. Here's a story that may be interesting. Here's a story that may hopefully be entertaining, be like a nice thing for someone to spend some time on, and hopefully maybe even inspire them to think something, maybe feel something. But I wouldn't dare to presume that here I am putting something down for the record. And I feel, so I don't even think of library, right? I don't think of book. I think of, I write for magazines and newspapers and for the internet, very ephemeral sort of media.
Yeah.
And I don't know, maybe I just don't have the ego to think this is timeless work. That said, I do want to say also that I don't think of the thing I want to do as being disposable, right? I want to think of it as being something that can connect to something larger, can connect to a tradition, or can connect to an emotional or an intellectual experience that someone might have, or a sensory experience someone might have at the table on the plate. Can you ask the question again?
Well, it makes me think of when David Camp was here and somebody said, well, really, what do you think of your United States of Arugula? And he said, it ain't Proust. And then he thought for a minute, he said, but then neither was Proust. Timelessness.
Well, also for me, it depends if I write for the internet, for the magazine and whatnot. I put much more thought about the timelessness of what I write when I write a book.
Okay.
And then it's when I'm like, okay, maybe I have to give a second thought because this could actually end up in a library. And you never know.
So your ego is more involved than his, is what you
In books.
In
When I do
books.
books. When I do my daily job, when I'm writing about, stories about the U.S. for the magazine, of course I want to be relevant. Of course I want to be entertaining and engaging, but there's less pressure, definitely.
Well, and Pete, it's called the newspaper of record. So, how does this affect you at all? Do you?
Yeah, I've actually never thought about it before.
Well, I'm glad you came today.
Yeah, but
I've upset you.
I'm glad I didn't have to go first. Like 99% of what's published in magazines and newspapers doesn't deserve to last. It's just it's not meant to, and it shouldn't. I think actually probably the most lasting stuff that we publish in the dining section would be the recipes, because
They go into a book.
They go into books, but they get clipped, and I get letters from. I got a letter from somebody a couple of weeks ago who wanted to know where she could find a brand of chocolate that was called for in a recipe that was published in the New York Times in 1968. And she couldn't find the chocolate anymore, so she couldn't make the recipe. And I was so just amazed by this that I spent some time trying to track this chocolate down.
Well, wait a second. You've got a good group here. What was it called? This is the group.
It was called Eagle.
Eagle?
Mallet, Eagle what? There's another, the three words. Mallet, Eagle.
9 people in this audience
Sweet.
have some at
Mallet,
home in the
sweet.
freezer. Right?
Mallard.
Is what recommended it in her the Flourless French chocolate roll in her TV show in the early 50s.
Okay. So, all right. So, Pete,
there we go.
Pete, you should be aware that they're watching, reading, and remembering things like crazy. So maybe it's not 90%. Maybe it's a little bit less than 90% is ephemera. But in the newspaper, we publish a lot of facts, and we try to get the facts right. And the reason we try to get the facts right is because somebody's going to look them up 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now. And that stuff should be there. What happened on this day in 2008? That stuff should be there. So it's lasting in that sense, but I don't think anyone's going to read our front page story on Spitzer's resignation as literature. But they'll read it to see what was the mood in Albany on that day. But the recipes are in a different sphere. The recipe is new every time you make it, and it comes to life every time you make it. all right.
It's never the same twice.
It's never the same twice.
So in that way, the recipes are probably closer to literature. The experience of reading Proust is that the book is different every time you open it.
I'm going to stop and listen to that one. That's wonderful. That's really wonderful. I was with a group of people, and one of the people involved we were visiting a region, it was in Seattle, and this woman just never shut up. She didn't listen to anybody else. Most of what she said was like that news that it really wasn't worth remembering or hearing the first time. And at one point she threw up her hands and she said, I love being a blogger. There's no editor. And we all thought to ourselves, could we have one now? Will you say a word, please, each of you? And I guess, Judith, if you want to go first, there's a question about bloggers and about blogging and about its impact on writing about food.
Well, I think an awful lot of people are getting their information about food on these blogs. I mean, they go home and want to cook a little broiled chicken, and they look it up on the internet. They Google it, I guess. I don't know what they do. But I think it is having an effect on cookbook sales, the impact of cookbooks. It's quick, it's easy, and what's distressing is that the author doesn't much matter. It's just a formula. It doesn't have the kind of information that makes you a really good cook, as against just throwing it together. So I think it's having some impact.
And Pete, I keep saying that a blog from the New York Times to me is usually made up of things that didn't make it into the New York Times. I mean, because it seems to me that everybody else blogging all over the country is just doing it so they can try to get into the New York Times. I mean, am I overstating it? Or, I mean, how do you feel about blogs in general? I said that out loud, didn't I? I made him laugh. Apparently we struck a note, struck a chord, just a little tiny bit of a chord.
I wrote an essay a couple of years ago about how much I hate food blogs. And it was like, it was almost like the tuna story, except instead of the tuna industry, it was like every food blogger in America was attacking me.
Yeah.
So I am loath to crucify myself again.
That being said,
but you know, I don't know. It's, in some ways, I think that the New York Times blogs are strange because often they don't read like blogs to me because they're written by professional, trained journalists, and they can't get that training out of their system no matter how hard they try. So that you know, the nature of a blog should be really quick and off the cuff, and a lot of ours are little reported stories. So you know, in that sense, I think that a lot of blogs are bloggier than our blogs.
I'll add that to my dictionary. Francis?
You have to give me a second on this because I have to sort of like grab these things out of the air and put them together. But a friend of mine once said to me, I think blogs are destroying the state of American letters. And that's a really strong statement.
Yeah.
And I don't know that it's true, but I see where you're saying it. I think the question that I want to ask of that moment you had is, why does this person not want an editor, right? What's behind that? Oh, I love it. I don't have an editor. I was thinking. Well, right, and that's definitely a part of it, right? But like, I feel like, again, I think to the great work that I feel has come as a result, and not even in terms of product, but in process of my working with editors who I really appreciate and respect and admire. It's like the editor, and when you look at the product, the editor is like MSG, right? You kind of don't know it's there. It makes it taste a little better. It makes it taste more like itself, right? Which is really important, I think. And it also gives you a splitting headache and like parched mouth, and like when I get really bad MSG, it's like it feels like you can't breathe and your like chest is constricting. Like,
right, I know that one.
So that's really like I was like, oh, that's a perfect metaphor. And so is the blogger happy about not having an editor because they don't want it to taste better? And okay, we can get into another conversation about whether MSG is legitimate or not, but whatever. Or do they not want to have an editor because they don't want that headache piece of it?
Yeah.
And do they not want to get to that point where you have to push yourself and you have to experience a little bit of discomfort in order to learn, right? Again, I keep thinking about learning and teaching, right? And how discomfort is the nature of learning. You don't learn anything when you're sitting back on a couch and on a sofa and just like, oh yeah, what's up? Like, you're not learning anything there. It's not invaluable. I mean, it's not a bad thing, but you're not learning. But on the other hand, there is also, I think, something to be said about this thing, this sort of thing that is an unfiltered, very immediate journal. When you talked about, the Times being the paper of record, and does that impact the work that Pete or everyone at the Times does? Like, I don't know, but because I think it's the paper of record, but it's also at the same time it's a living document, right? There's a new one every day.
Right.
There's a new one every day, and I don't think the idea is on March 13th, the New York Times that day is bang, that's history, that's the record. But I think the idea is when you look at it, when you pull back a little bit and you look at the thing as a whole, it's a process, right? Which is sort of like the whole Wikipedia thing. Is Wikipedia like a really a thing, or is it just a process? I'm going way far outside the question. But I think there is something to be said about the idea of blogs as being unfiltered, unmediated experiences, but part of that is you understand they're not finished product.
Blogs and writing, there's nothing like real in-person conversation. Let's give them a big round of applause. what I want to do to make sure that we have time before they lock the library is to invite you all back so that these nice people can spend some time with you individually. The book is for sale. The Friends of write-up is there. Pete Mondavi Jr. has once again sent us a little something in bottles, chilled, to go with our farmers market foods that are back there as well. Thank you all for coming. We'll see you very soon. Again, thank you, panel, for a wonderful conversation.